Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak at this meeting. So the title, Staged or Concomitant Procedures, we will go into this. But when we're talking about combined procedures, not only about valve interventions, typically we combine left atrial appendage occlusion with a variety of procedures, such as coronary angiography, to be sure not to miss, for example, triple vessel disease, PCI, because it has implications for your anticoagulation regimen, with PFO or ASD closure, because we use those to get left atrial access. And what we're going to talk now about is a combination with TAVI and MitraClip. So 2 years ago, same meeting, fairly similar title, but at that time I didn't have any evidence for my talk. There is a slight difference because the title in 2015 was Going Beyond the Obvious. I was quite pleased to get invited today with the title Staged or Concomitant. So combining the procedures seems to be accepted or has become accepted within the last 2 years. So the question is no longer whether to combine, but the question is whether combined procedures should be done staged or concomitantly. So I want to go into a voting question. Do you guys have experience with concomitant procedures? 1 would be yes, and 2 would be no, so please vote now. So about a quarter of the people in here would do procedures concomitantly, so that's interesting. Let's go back to the slides, please. So staged or combined at the same sitting. I think so. Why would you do them concomitantly? I think a big reason to do this is patient comfort and maybe even patient safety. Others argue I would rather do this in a staged manner because there are financial disincentives by my health care system, or some may believe that it is safer to do the combined procedures staged. Why not doing these procedures concomitantly? It's of course more expensive, it takes more time, it also takes usually more contrast. Sheaths are not compatible if you talk about MitraClip and left atrial appendage occlusion, or some would argue the transeptal puncture that you do for your MitraClip procedure doesn't work for the left atrial appendage occlusion. And some would argue that if you have after MitraClip a low flow in the left atrium, that you have a higher risk for device thrombus, and therefore they would maybe keep the patient on oral anticoagulation. And some would argue that it doesn't work for valvular atrial fibrillation. So here this is clearly wrong, because mitral insufficiency or mitral regurgitation is not considered valvular atrial fibrillation. So why do I combine MitraClip and left atrial appendage occlusion? Let me bring up this analogy. When you go on your vacation in Italy and you buy one of these beautiful wines they have in Italy. So why do you do this? Why do you buy the wine in Italy and bring it back home? It's a very simple answer, because you're already there. So you buy it there and you bring it back home. The same is true for MitraClip. You're in the left atrium, you perform your MitraClip procedure, you're already there. Just exchange the sheath and close the appendage on your way home, as was done here. Other reasons to do it concomitantly or at the same sitting is the patient population we're dealing with. So this is a summary of the 3 big registries on MitraClip. You can see the average age was 74. Cerebrovascular disease was quite prominent, hypertension in almost 3/4 of all patients, renal disease in 40%, and all these are risk factors for bleeding. So a high bleeding risk is a Hasbled score of 3 or more, and the majority of your MitraClip patients will achieve a high Hasbled score. So let's vote again. If you do the procedures concomitantly, would you think that it is a high risk to do them concomitantly for more complications, or are you not worried about this? So the majority of you think doing these procedures together in one procedure may result in higher complications. Let's go back to my slides, please. The combination is safe, so there is no real reason to be worried to combine the two procedures. We published this, it's in Press in Eurointervention, where we compared a group where we did MitraClip together with left atrial appendage occlusion to a group where we only did MitraClip. All these patients suffered atrial fibrillation, and you can see no difference in any safety endpoint. So the combination is safe, so if you want to do it, how do you do this? You have two options. You can use your MitraClip sheath, and you have to make the delivery wire of your occluder longer, or you can replace the MitraClip sheath. You can do this with a figure-8 stitch at the puncture site because you downsize your sheath size. So you go down to only 14 French if you use an Amplatzer device, for example, and then you have to make sure it's not continuously bleeding as you perform your left atrial appendage occlusion after MitraClip. You have two options: to just do a figure-8 suture, or more expensively you can use pre-closure of the vein. So I'm going to show you a short video how this was done. This was a live case during TCT I did together with my surgical partner, Francesco Maisano. And in this case, since it was a live case, we were choosing for the more expensive option with a ProGlide for pre-closure of the vein. So you see we reintroduce the obturator into the MitraClip sheath just to get the wire in. It's important to use the introducer in order not to introduce air, and like this you can then downsize the access site by just pulling on the ProGlide or by tightening the figure-8 stitch, and you can see it's not bleeding at all. And the procedure can then safely be performed as usual. You remove the obturator a little bit, you engage the left atrial appendage, and as you can see here, the sheath fits perfectly well into the appendage. Sometimes you need to give a little bit more counterclock because you're coming in fairly high into the appendage, because it's usually or typically a higher puncture than what you would in an ideal world do for your LAA occlusion. But it has never ever been an issue during one of these procedures. So there's a lot of talking during the live case. It takes a while until we decided on the size of the device, and then here now you can see deployment. And again, the angle of the sheath really doesn't seem to be an issue at all. This is what we saw before. There was some overlay of the echo image. It's more disturbing to me than helpful, but most of you think that this is the future. I'm not sure. So anyhow, this is deployment. I think it fits perfectly well into the left atrial appendage, and the result is perfect. So with what most would call a not ideal puncture of the septum, you can achieve such a result. So I think this is not a concern, the unfavorable transseptal puncture. The very low flow in the left atrium, this can be a concern. So maybe, I don't know the answer, you put the patient on 1 month of oral anticoagulation after you do this combined procedure. I don't know. And some people are concerned that if you cut or if you close the left atrial appendage, you also close a reservoir and you reduce the left atrial size. I think that's more a theoretical concern because these patients typically suffer advanced diastolic dysfunction, and the cardiac output is really not dependent on filling in these patients. So with the marriage between St. Jude and Abbott, we also have two devices that are now married together. We have the amulet and the MitraClip, and I hope that this marriage of the two devices will be as successful as the marriage of St. Jude and Abbott. And this is the ideal company to sponsor a randomized trial in the field, and I hope that all the people from the company were listening at the moment. The other valvular intervention that you can do combined with left atrial appendage occlusion is obviously TAVR, and this is a fairly advanced field. You see here a procedure. TAVR was done after this, going in with a multi-purpose catheter, looking for the PFO, finding the PFO and using the PFO for the left atrial appendage occlusion right in the same procedure. The appendage was occluded successfully, as you can see here. I'm always impressed by the size of these occluders. They're usually even bigger than the valve you put in. And on the way home, again, the analogy to buying wine in Italy, I closed the PFO on the way out. So this is a fairly established procedure at our institution, combining TAVR and left atrial appendage occlusion. And my last question to you would be, if you would do these combined procedures, would you be worried about the health economic aspect, that you have to use 3 procedures in one, yes or no? Or is it more that you're not convinced that this is clinically indicated at all? Maybe we, well, I think you just didn't understand what this was about, because no. So the question was, apparently it wasn't clear whether you would do it or not. Initially it was voted 30-60, and this now would be, is it mainly health economic aspects why you're not considering doing it? But apparently the question wasn't clear. So let's go back to my slides. The combination of TAVR and left atrial appendage occlusion is established, as I told you. We published this in JACC Intervention. There were no safety concerns, and with only 30-day follow-up, we could show that there are no efficacy concerns, but of course we couldn't prove that it is more efficient. And in this field, TAVR and left atrial appendage occlusion, a randomized trial is underway. So in conclusion, I think combined interventions provide immediate protection from bleeding complications for this high-risk population. These combined procedures are safe. There is no safety issue or no safety concern if you combine them. And of course, these are much more patient-friendly, and this is particularly important in this elderly, often frail patient clientele. A randomized trial for MitraClip and left atrial appendage occlusion, though, is needed. And with this, I would like to thank you very much.